Enjoy this faith-filled short story. Strength in the Psalms. Emily sat alone on the edge of her bed, staring blankly at the empty room around her. It had been 2 weeks since the accident, 2 weeks since her husband, Mark, had been taken from her in the blink of an eye. The grief felt like a weight pressing down on her chest, making it hard to breathe, let alone think. The days had blurred together, full of well-meaning condolences and awkward silences, but inside, she felt as if she were drowning. How could God allow something so cruel to happen? She had prayed for Mark's safety every day, begged for his protection, and yet God had allowed this tragedy. Where was God now? Where was his love in the midst of her pain? Her faith, once a steady foundation beneath her feet, now felt like shifting sand. She picked up her Bible from the nightstand, the worn pages a silent reminder of the years she had spent seeking God's presence in the quiet moments of her life. But now, in this unbearable storm, she didn't know where to begin. With trembling hands, she flipped through the pages, searching for something, anything, to anchor her in the midst of the chaos. Her eyes landed on the Psalms. She remembered how Mark used to read them to her before bed, especially the ones that spoke of God's faithfulness, his nearness in times of trouble. She began to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. "The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul." Her breath caught in her throat as the words filled the silence of the room. She had heard them so many times before, but now they felt different. They were no longer just words on a page, they were a lifeline. "Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me." Tears began to fall, not just for Mark, but for herself, for the anger and doubt that had filled her heart in the wake of his death. She had been so consumed by her pain, she had forgotten that God's presence was still with her, even in the darkest moments. Emily closed her eyes, clinging to the words she had just read. She remembered the words of Jesus, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." She had been carrying this burden alone, thinking she had to manage it all by herself. But Jesus had promised rest. He had promised peace. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was time to let go of her own striving and allow him to carry her. The weight didn't lift immediately, and the sorrow didn't vanish. But in that moment, Emily felt something she hadn't felt in days. Hope. Hope that, even though she didn't understand why this had happened, God was still good. He was still with her. His love for her hadn't changed, even in the midst of her grief. She turned to another psalm. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted and saves the crushed in spirit." The words seemed to echo in the stillness of the room, and Emily whispered them over and over again, as if to remind herself that God was near. He had not abandoned her. He was near, even in her brokenness. Over the following weeks, Emily continued to seek comfort in the Psalms. She read them in the morning, before bed, and at times when the grief threatened to overwhelm her. Each verse, each promise, became a lifeline, drawing her closer to the God who had never left her side. One day, as she sat by the window watching the sunset, she reflected on the journey she had been through. She wasn't fully healed, but she was learning to trust again. God hadn't answered all her questions, but he had given her something far more precious, his presence, his peace, and the assurance that he would never leave her. She opened her Bible to Psalm 46. "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear, though the earth gives way, though the mountains be moved into the heart of the sea, though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains tremble at its swelling." With a deep, steadying breath, Emily smiled softly, feeling a sense of calm she hadn't felt in weeks. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew she wasn't facing it alone. God was with her, and that was enough. Reflection. The Psalms had become Emily's refuge in the storm. Each word, each promise, reminded her that even in the darkest moments of grief and loss, God's word is a source of strength and comfort. Through the Psalms, She rediscovered a faith that was not based on the absence of pain, but on the unshakable presence of a faithful God.